Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Wednesday night reading of the book of Ecclesiastes. And we're glad that you could join us tonight. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into the book. We're going to be from chapter 5, verse 8 through the end of chapter 6. So a little bit more verses reading this week than last week. The book of Ecclesiastes is a wonderful book to read. Sometimes it might seem confusing, sometimes maybe even depressing. But overall, there's a message about how to enjoy life and how to enjoy life with God. And when we understand the place God has in the world, including our lives, and the place that we have in the world, including our lives, enjoyment of life can happen a lot more freely. And so we're looking forward to reading the wonderful words from this book. And so we're going to play a couple of songs as we've been doing just to get going and welcome other people into the audience, but glad again that you have joined us. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, beginning at verse 8 through the end of chapter 6 this evening.
Holy words, long preserved for our walk in this world. They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Words of life, words of hope. Give us strength, help us cope. In this world, wherever we roam, ancient words will guide us home. Ancient words, ever true, changing me and changing you. We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Holy words of our faith, handed down to this age, came to us through sacrifice. Oh, heed the faithful words of Christ. Holy words, long preserved for our walk in this world. They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Ancient words, ever true, changing me and changing you. We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Ancient words, ever true, changing me and changing you. We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart. We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. Rest in the arms of His embrace.
Very beautiful songs to think about and have our minds focus on. Be still and know that I am God. And that's a wonderful instruction from God to his children, right? To just stop what we're doing, to stop spinning in our mind, to stop trying to control things that are out of our control, and to just be still and just know that he is God, to just trust in him, that he knows how to do things. That's kind of what goes along with wisdom literature, and it kind of goes along with our readings in the book of Ecclesiastes. You remember last week we left off with Solomon's instructions, right, about coming towards God in order to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, to humble ourselves before the mighty hand of God and just trust that he will lift us up in due time. And so we're going to begin again this week, chapter 5, verse 8, through the end of chapter 6, as I said. A little bit longer of a reading, but the first section is going to be verses 8 through 17. And what you're going to notice through the book of Ecclesiastes is you have these little conclusions before he gets to the grand conclusion. And one of the conclusions of a section is chapter 5, verses 18 through 20. And actually, he does these conclusions 6 different times in the book before he gets to his major conclusion about life. And he adds a little bit more. And so you think Solomon is kind of just repeating himself over and over and over again. It sounds like that. But if you break them down, you'll notice that he adds a little bit every time. And so he's making us more complete or more mature as we go through the reading of the book of Ecclesiastes. So beginning in verse 8, we're going to read through verse 17. Solomon says, "If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter, for the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them, and what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. There is a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go, and what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and anger." And so you get kind of a repetition here of what Solomon's been getting at as he goes through the truth of life or the meaning of life. But it's interesting that in between or sandwiched in the middle of these speakings about the futility of wealth, or at least striving for wealth, is that statement about approaching God and remembering that God is in heaven and we're not, right? And we need to listen to him and bow before him and fear him. And it's right sandwiched there. But he begins again and he talks here again. And remember, he said in chapter 4, envy is something that we need to be working against, right? We need to work against the practice of envy. And sometimes it feels like it just happens to us, but envy really is a choice we make, that we become envious of another. And so we work against the practice of envy, this culture of economic competition. Christians aren't involved in that, or God's children aren't involved in that. One of the attributes of God's children, and this has been true for so long, hasn't it? But one of the characteristics or attributes is that they are a generous people. They are a sharing people. And right from the birth of the church, it seems that this has been true of God's true children. And so there's a danger in a culture of economic competition. It's us versus them, or we've got to do better than them, and so on. Or if they're doing better than us, we must improve, and so on. So we want to avoid that. And he gets back into this, and he talks about this exploitation, right? Or this lack of justice in the courts. And you'll notice he's talking kind of like economic exploitation, because he says, if you see in a province the oppression of the poor, and this is a sad reality of human living, is that the rich have often oppressed the poor, that the rich have power and the poor get exploited. And one of the things Solomon says here, however, is don't be amazed that you see it. don't be surprised. You know, one of the things Jesus said to his disciples, the poor you will always have with you. And that's not an excuse Jesus is giving to just simply neglect the poor or not do as much as you can to end poverty. That's not what Jesus is saying, but this is a sad reality of a world that is not led by God. When human interests take precedence, the exploitation of the poor is not a surprise. So don't be amazed by it. But one thing Solomon does say, and he's been saying this a few times, dropping hints, right? That somehow God will judge between the righteous and the wicked. Remember that? And now he says that the high official is watched by a higher. And we understand this, is that somehow God hears the cry of the poor. God hears the cry of the oppressed. And so don't be surprised that it happens, but understand that this high official answers to someone higher still. And there's always this promise that there is a God of justice. And somehow and sometime, God will bring about the justice that we have failed to deliver here on earth. That God will do this. And so Solomon says, don't be surprised by it. And then he gives us strange verse in verse 9, and scholars and commentators have had a hard time with this, and I'm not too sure about it, so I'm just going to take a stab at it here because it's really uncertain in the original language. But somehow, when a king understands that the land is good for everyone, then it's good, right? There's something about that. This is a gain for a land in every way. A king committed to cultivated fields. One of the things that the Hebrews or the Israelites, their economy was such that as families were given their inheritance in the land, that was according to justice. But through the years, as some people would drop into poverty, one of the things they were supposed to do, remember, was to leave the corners of their field. So they were to work it. They were to, it was their crops, but they were to leave it. And everyone was supposed to be able to have enough to eat. Everyone was supposed to be able to have something of which to go on. And so this is something that Solomon says here. And he goes on again, and he talks again about this striving for wealth, right? That he who loves money will not be satisfied with money. And there's this refrain from seeking wealth, that this is not your goal in life. This craving after income, this craving after riches, this craving after money. He says, you've got to kind of refrain from seeking wealth and hoarding it when you have it. You have this, but you got to kind of refrain from hoarding it, because wealth does not create contentment. And it's so contrary to the way the world thinks at times, right? It may be contrary to what seems to be natural for us, is that somehow if I had enough, I would be content. But then what is enough? And really, what is enough for me to be content? What is enough that I no longer worry about whether I have enough? And all these different things. Wealth doesn't create contentment. And there's a warning in the New Testament for those who would love riches and so on. There's a reason for this, is because it just doesn't give what it seems to promise on the surface here. Wealth doesn't create contentment. Instead, Solomon says, wealth creates a craving. He'll say in the next chapter, as we'll see, that it's an appetite. It's this craving here. And he says it's absurd. And the other thing is, you'll notice if you follow verses 10 through 12, how it distracts us from enjoying our present moment. This craving for wealth distracts us from truly enjoying our portion in life, or what we're doing right now. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And so all of a sudden, more and more come and want a part of it and so on. And the owner has no advantage. And then you'll notice verse 12, and this is where Solomon has been drawing us, right? Remember that it's not the fruits of our labor that bring joy, but our labor itself. Remember Solomon said that we're grateful for the things we might take for granted, the food and drink, and the joy in our toil. And so notice what he says in verse 12, sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much. And this is something, you want to talk about having an enjoyable life. It's having a sweet sleep, right? It's being able to rest. It's being able to be at ease. It's that feeling of contentment. And he says, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. The person who's just craving possessions, who's craving wealth, who's craving standing, who's craving status, they're anxious when they go to bed. They're worried about how much they have or whether they can keep it and all these different things. So then he goes on in verses 13 through 17, and he talks here about something that we've all witnessed before. And he just brings up an example, but he says, those who clutch can quickly crash. Those who hoard can lose it all. And he says this is a grievous evil. Like you're just clinging and holding on to your things and all these things, and you can crash. And then he brings up what sounds like from Job, right? That in verse 15, as he came from his mother's womb, so shall he go again. Naked came I, naked shall I return, right? I had nothing Paul says we brought nothing into the world. We're going to take nothing out. And this is a truth. And so we're actually, when we're craving wealth and craving possessions, we're actually toiling for the wind because we're holding on to something that's really not there. It's going to be gone. And so Solomon says, what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? All his days he eats in darkness and much vexation and sickness and in anger. And there's just this, it's not lasting. So it doesn't bring contentment. And it doesn't last forever. And it seems like Solomon's been on this tune for quite a while, right? But maybe it's a tune that Solomon has figured out and he's played too much in his life, right? All the stuff that he had, all the riches and everything, and he just didn't have. One thing we might say is Solomon didn't have the kind of true riches that his father David seemed to enjoy. And so this brings us to verses 18 through 20. And it's one of those mini conclusions of the section that began in chapter 3. But verse 18 through 20, listen to what Solomon says now. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. And so Solomon now is introducing something that we didn't really get a glimpse of in the first couple of chapters, where he just says everything is useless, everything is vanity, everything is a striving after the wind. And he talked about death and the certainty of death and how it made one feel hopeless and you're just going to be like the beasts of the earth and all these different things. But he talks now about something about life that is enjoyable. And he's been bringing us along, but he adds a lot to this for a moment. One of the things that Solomon is teaching us here is that we should be pursuing enjoyment, not worldly possessions, not accumulating worldly possessions. If you can find enjoyment, you've got something that no possession can give you. And Jesus talked about that, right? You know, earthly treasures that rust and moths and they get destroyed and all these, and they can be stolen. But seek enjoyment, not worldly accumulation. But we want to remember it's not the kind of enjoyment that he sought in chapter 1 and chapter 2, remember, but he's going to talk a little bit specifically about the enjoyment. And so he says, this is what I have seen. Now, way back in Genesis chapter 1, when God looked at all that he had created, it said, behold, it was good. And now Solomon says, this is what I have seen to be good. This is what I have seen to be good and fitting, or good and right. And this is without moral problem. What I have seen to be good, without moral problems here. And this is what he's talking about here. He brings it up again. The ability to enjoy the toil or the labor in what God has granted as your portion or lot. Find enjoyment in all the toil that God has given him, with the days of his life that God has given him, for this is his portion, or this is his lot. When Adam and Eve were created and put in that beautiful garden that God had seen that was good, they were instructed to work. And if you think about this, before sin enters the world and they're instructed to work, there must have been enjoyment in their work. Noah, after the flood, when God had cleansed the earth, he became a man of the soil. He worked. And so Solomon does say we need to eat and drink. So we eat and drink. We don't take those things for granted, and we find enjoyment in our labor. Now, Solomon is going to describe for us here, work is not a means to an end. And you know, sometimes people will say this, well, it's a paycheck. All right. It is a paycheck, and it's how we work in order to live and so on. But Solomon here says it's not simply a means to an end, but it is a source of enjoyment and satisfaction. It actually is a source of contentment, of enjoyment, satisfaction. And there is a difference between working to pursue wealth and working to pursue joy or to pursue a purpose. There's a huge difference there. Now, Solomon gets into something here, because he doesn't say wealth and possessions are wrong, but notice what he says in verse 19, also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, but notice, to accept his lot, and even this person to rejoice in his toil. That it's the source of contentment and enjoyment. This is, Solomon says, watch this, the gift of God. And Solomon now is reminding us that we are not responsible for the gifts of enjoyment and so on. God is. This is the gift of God. This is the gift of God. And the reward for this, unlike what he sounded like, where he said life was meaningless and life, why not just get it over with because it just was this long drawn out road to death. Notice what he says in verse 20, he will not much remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. Do you see that? Isn't that a beautiful idea there in verse 20? He will not much remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. Unlike the pursuit of wealth or the craving of wealth, which keeps us distracted from enjoying the moment, God keeps us enjoying the moment that we're not looking at the length of our days. One of the things we say often at funerals, right? He lived a good life. What do we mean by that? He enjoyed himself. He lived a good life. He will not much remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. This really is the pursuit that's worthwhile, isn't it? to recognize God as the grantor of a portion, to recognize God as the giver of gifts and so on, right? To eat, to drink, to find enjoyment in your labor, and to not be like overwhelmed by how long the days are and how I'm just waiting for it to be over, but you find enjoyment in your heart, and that occupies you. So then we get to chapter 6, and Solomon seems to be keeping this main theme going for a moment. He's not going to always talk about this, but it is a big part of life, isn't it? It really is a big part of life. Worldly things, that's a big part of life, and having the right attitude about worldly things is a very important achievement, getting the right attitude about worldly things. Okay, verses 1 through 6. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, chapter 6, and it lies heavy on mankind. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires. Yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It is a grievous evil. So there's in chapter 5, verse 19, right? God gives them the power to enjoy them. Chapter 6, verse 1 and verse 2, God does not give the power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It is grievous evil. Verse 3, if a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, that'd be... you wonder why 100, but anyways, and lives many years. I had 3, and 3 seems to take up enough of my time. I don't want 100. But anyways, 100 children, lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things. And he also has no burial. I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For it comes in vanity and goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it has not seen the sun or known anything, yet it finds rest rather than he. Even though he should live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoy no good, do not all go to one place. And so when we look at chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, the 100 children and, all these riches, one of the things we were reminded of, and this is a truth that we know, right, is that things are not always as they seem. Things are not always as they seem. Someone has everything that you could possibly want, and he doesn't enjoy them. He's just not happy. And everyone else looking on from the outside would say, man, that guy must be so happy because look at all the stuff he has, right? This practice of envy that we've got to fight against, right? This economic competition, so on. But things aren't always the way they seem. That this is grievous. Someone has all this stuff and he's not enjoying them. We know people like that. We see people in the news. We see people in Hollywood. We see people in the business world, and they're always stressing, and they're just not enjoying. And some of these people, when you look at some of the scandals that have come down, they really are not enjoying life because they got to seem to go darker and darker into things to try to find something that they enjoy. And it's kind of sickening, actually, when you look at what some of the rich people of the world get into. But anyways, things aren't always the way they seem. This is absurd. It's a grievous evil. Someone has all this stuff and they just don't enjoy it. And a stranger ends up enjoying it. Then he talks about a guy having 100 kids and yet he's not satisfied with his life. He's not happy with life's good things. And he says, like, what's the point of all this, right? Things just aren't always as they seem. And Solomon goes to, like we all end up going to one place anyways. And so things aren't always the way they seem. And I read a good line, do we add years to our life? And do we add life to our years? Self-preservation is a big law of nature, isn't it? That when we look at the animal kingdom, they preserve their life. That's what they want to do. But for humans, is that enough? Or just adding years to our life, or do we add life to our years? And so he goes on, and we're going to read the last section here as he answers verses 1 through 6. Verse 7. All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. What advantage has the wise man over the fool? And what does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, and that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity, and what is the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? So when we kind of get into this a little bit more, we start to hear what Solomon is talking about, and he compares the craving of life with appetite or lust, right? And really, that's what it is. Sometimes when we hear the word lust, we think of sexual immorality or whatever like that. But the craving of wealth is similar. It's a lust. It's an appetite, and we know that the good life is to be not controlled by our appetites. We don't want to be just like animals. That's how animals live, and that's not what we're supposed to be like. We know, in fact, that doesn't bring humans the best of life. And human greed is a terribly unsatisfying evil. It just doesn't bring satisfaction. And all the working for things we want, all the wishing for things we want is useless. To constantly be wishing for things that we want is a waste of energy. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of emotion. To constantly be wishing, to constantly be wanting. All the toil of man is for his mouth, and yet his appetite is not satisfied. What advantage has the wise over the fool? What does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? And Solomon now answers, he says, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. It's better. And so, the Apostle Paul talked about the wisdom of the world versus the foolishness of God, right? In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, and you can look at verse 20 and verse 21 for instance. But Solomon's getting into this now for a moment. This idea here, self-preservation may be the law of nature when it comes to animals and so on, but it's not the law of creatures that are made in God's image. We are living for something more than just our appetite. We're living for something more than just our lustful desires. So he says in verses 10 through 12, and you'll notice that it is known what man is and that he's not able to dispute with one stronger than he. And if you think for a moment, mankind cannot contend with God. We can try to take matters into our own hands. We can try to control and we can try to change. We cannot dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity, and what is the advantage to man? And he ends with those questions in verse 12, and he seems to have been bringing this up. One of the things we learn when we read the book of Ecclesiastes, as Solomon asks these questions, it's not that he doesn't have an answer. He's not making conclusions when he's asking questions, right? This is a big difference here for a moment. Sometimes Jesus asked questions. It didn't mean he didn't know the answer, right? What does it profit a man for you to gain the whole world and forfeit his own soul? Jesus knew the answer. He wasn't asking that question. Well, Solomon's kind of doing the same thing here in verse 12. Who knows? Well, you can't contend with God. So who knows, verse 12, what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? So who does know? Who knows what is good for him? Well, in chapter 5 and verse 18, he says, what I have seen to be good is to eat, drink, find enjoyment in your toil, and recognize that this is what God has given you. This is your portion. Who knows what is good? Then he asked that question. It's not the first time he's asked it in this book, he says, who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? Well, who can tell a human what will happen to them after the sun? Who can do that? Well, we know someone who can. The one that you can't contend with. One of the things Solomon is teaching us, we don't live expecting the worst so we'll never be disappointed. Ben Franklin, that was very witty, but that's not how we live. We don't live expecting the worst so we're never disappointed, but we live understanding that human wisdom, human effort, human control is inadequate, even if it's comforting to us. You know, it might be comforting to us I'm going to make these plans and I'm going to control these things. Or I'm going to have these sayings that I'm going to live by, but they're inadequate. Human wisdom is inadequate. And one of the things Solomon is going to teach us is that we can enjoy life remembering that we're going to die. We know our limitations. We are realistic about life. We will die. But we can enjoy life. We can enjoy our toil. And that joy can keep us occupied, that we're not stressing that life is going to end. Things we take for granted, we actually forget until we lose them. You think about all the things you might take for granted. It might be people, but food and breathing and drinking and, you know, all these things that you could take for granted. And all of a sudden, you start to forget about them. You take them for granted until you lose them. Once you lose them, then all of a sudden you don't take them for granted anymore. But when you remember to be thankful, when you're truly thankful for the food, for the drink, for the company, for the companionship, for the air we breathe, for the ability we have, when we're truly thankful, we are constantly reminded how great these gifts are. And we're also reminded how great the giver of these gifts is. When we take things for granted, we forget them until we lose them. And we're actually taking God for granted when we take them for granted. But when we remember to be thankful, we're really reminded how great these gifts really are and how much enjoyment in life we can really have to just simply eat and drink and be thankful for our labor, for our ability. So we'll pick it up next week with chapter 7 and a little bit of chapter 8. Just want to give an update, if you don't know, is that Carl and I did get back early Sunday morning after a long car ride, and she's on the mend here at home, and we hope to be able to see them soon. So we're definitely thankful for that. Sunday morning, we're going to be in lesson 4 of Acts chapter 3, and keep showing up. And we're going to be in the final lesson in lesson 4 at 11:30 on the YouTube channel, Beyond Being Normal, based on Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. You can look us up on the web, windsorchurchofchrist.weebly.com. And if you have any requests, you can email me at westsidewindsorcoc@gmail.com. Would you bow with me in prayer? Father God, we are so thankful for you. We're thankful that you watch over us. We're thankful that you give us so many great gifts in this life to enjoy, Father. Father, you give us more than we need, and help us to not take these gifts for granted, Father. Help us, Father, to fight against the practice of envy, that we don't look at what others have and become envious of them or of the things they have, Father. That you help us to really appreciate all the ways that you have blessed us. And help us, Father, to not be those who hoard, but are those who are willing to share. It is through Jesus' name we pray. Amen. God bless everyone.